Hello everyone, I am Moto Legacy of NZP Team, here to kickstart our part in the HTC event. Also joining me today is Blubs Will Rule and Derped Crusader, who will, in that order, come after my last part here to show off their specific contributions since my last talk at 2021's event. Contrary to my last two appearances, I am primarily going to speak about the efforts I've made with our PSP builds to be more performant and easier to handle. Before this though, it's important to showcase the general improvements made to NZP's gameplay, and what better way to kick that off than with the trailer for the improved Nacht der Untoten. A big thank you to Jackson Clayton for making this for the team on such a short notice. To longtime followers, seeing Nacht der Untoten once again may not seem too interesting of a feat, but this refresh represents a newly adopted fundamental, parity with the source material. Nacht der Untoten, among many other features and functions, were redesigned in order to improve their accuracy. Whether it's the power-ups during gameplay you snag, the weapons you obtain, or the secrets you find, no matter what you do, NZP will feel right at home during your playthrough. Of course, more has been going on than just this over the last 2 years. I briefly mentioned in 2021 NZP's dire level situation, a general lack of content we've asked the community to contribute towards fixing, and they've definitely delivered. Dive into the trenches of Fegefeuer, explore the sewers of Dungeon, or make your last stand in Bunker Defense. These maps, plus others, are all bundled into the base game. But how did we get here? What I mean is, NZP was notorious for very poor performance, constantly crashing during gameplay, having generally abysmally low frame rates. Yet Nacht der Untoten is pushing more polygons, with more diverse lighting effects, containing more props and weapons while still running better than its previous iteration. NZP has come much closer to matching the performance and fidelity of a commercial PSP title. The rest of my time here is going to be dedicated to detailing what all has been done to make this a reality. First, let's talk zombies. NZP's zombie models consist of 4 separate parts: the head, the left arm, the right arm, and the rest of the body. The process of rendering Quake MDL meshes is complicated. It can take dozens of CPU stalled draw calls to the GPU to render a single standard model. Multiply this by 4 for each zombie limb, and now 12, the maximum amount of zombies that can be on screen at once. The end result of this? A very easily achieved less than 10 frames per second in various levels when all 12 zombies, 48 meshes, are on screen. So what can be done about this? Well, it turns out the answer is actually rather straightforward. We already have dealt with this. 9 years ago, a regression somewhere down the development had caused a hack implemented by Blubs to go unused. The hack is pretty straightforward. If all of a zombie's limbs are intact, instead of rendering all of its body parts individually, render a different, full body mesh instead, so the amount of rendered meshes goes down from 48 to 12. This decreased amount of display lists sent to the GPU had shockwaves of performance in high rounds. Here's that same test sample running 50% faster. Another large optimization made was that of memory. In my last appearance, I made some statements about the VRAM bandwidth requirements, colored 4 bits per pixel light maps have. What I did not expect at the time, however, was that VRAM is not even being used for light maps at all. A large amount of profiling showed us that due to some ignorant uses of textures and palettes in the past, VRAM was being completely occupied before the level had even begun loading. Textures were overflowing to main memory, resulting in even slower lookups. I personally spent hours looking at a list of every texture loaded in various instances, making sure every loaded texture was justified, its size was reasonable, and nothing in the texture was wasteful. We can do better than this though. NZP relies on WAD3 and PCX formatted textures. Each one of these textures contains a 256 color palette, and then the texture itself, which contains indexes to those palette bytes. This is easily implemented, so efficient for development. However, it is rather wasteful, since these textures do not fit into VRAM as nicely as you would expect. What does though? DXT1 or BC1 compressed textures. Offering 4 bits per pixel compression, DXT1 textures occupy half the memory space these paletted textures occupy. This is because the PSP has native hardware support for this format. With this knowledge, I've implemented on-the-fly texture conversion from these paletted formats to DXT1 by iterating over the palette RGB data and converting the data into a proper RGBA texture. All of this took a lot of work, but on top of it, there was a free VRAM save I would recommend every developer implement if they haven't already, which is limiting the color output of their display buffers to RGB 565. This alone shaves off around 500 kilobytes on a typical 512 by 512 allocated video display buffer. The differences in actual color output are negligible on hardware too, due to the LCD panels on units not offering the greatest color out anyway. The last thing I want to discuss with you all today is CPU profiling. Something interesting I've noticed, the lack of gprof love developers have given, some not even realizing the lib exists in the PSP SDK. libpsp gprof was a great tool on getting dumps of time spent by the CPU in different circumstances, and was responsible for me identifying several unnecessarily computationally expensive operations present in our engine, such as discovering an inefficient use of string comparisons to check if a texture was supposed to have different rendering properties, or becoming more aware of standard Quake bugs, like iterating over all of the polygons in the level more times than required. Profiling also allowed me to recognize the time wasted filling the PSP's sound buffers, being a catalyst for moving wave processing away from internal towards SDL2 to give a 50% speed up on average. These were just the biggest advances we've made on a technical level in order to push for higher detail, faster performing gameplay, and maps. Of course, we're GPL licensed, so you can view our GitHub for certain commits that all led to this. I'll probably be backporting a lot of this to vanilla Quake engines too, in order to speed those up. Now I'm going to pass the mic to Blubswillrule, who will talk a little bit about his knowledge of Quake MDL and his more advanced model exporter that led to higher fidelity meshes.
Hi everyone, I'm Luis, or Blubs. I'm a developer on the NZP team, and I've done a little bit of everything over the years. Today I'll be doing a deep dive on vertex swimming, and a trick we came up with to combat it. What is vertex swimming? As an animation plays, vertices appear to jump or swim around through space, rather than moving smoothly. Here I've animated the Colt from NZP's demo release to slide left and right, showing off the effects of vertex swimming. Why do vertices swim? In the Quake MDL file format, vertex positions are stored per frame as a single byte per each of the XYZ axes. Because a byte can only have 256 distinct values, that means a vertex can only be at one of 256 distinct locations along the XYZ axes in 3D space. As vertices move around in 3D space, they then snap from location to location. Why do we care? Iron sights. Iron sights are almost always made up of fine mesh details. And the Quake MDL exporter loves destroying these. On the left you can see the Colt from NZP's demo release as it was modeled in Blender, and on the right you can see what the MDL exporter did to it. Can we fix vertex swimming? Absolutely, but we need to add more bits to give the vertex positions more precision. Every additional bit subdivides the quantization grid and doubles the spatial resolution. Unfortunately, the models would now be in a custom data format and could no longer be loaded by off-the-shelf Quake engines. More importantly, this would increase the size both on disk and in memory. Given our target platform, low memory consumption is easily the single highest priority for this project. Thus, this is not an option. If we can't fix vertex swimming, can we at least control it? So if the vertex positions must be quantized by the quantization grid, how then is the quantization grid defined? Turns out the quantization grid is defined by an axis-aligned bounding box. It's defined by the left edge of the bounding box, the right edge of the bounding box, the bottom edge, top edge, front edge, and back edge. The MDL exporter sweeps through the animation, recording the smallest and largest positions of any vertex, and places the bounding box to fit the most extreme vertices. But what if we could manually specify this bounding box? We took a Blender Quake MDL exporter written by Robrohan and modified it to let the user specify the quantization bounding box. On the left you can see the quantization bounding box drawn in Blender's 3D viewport by the modified exporter, and on the right you can see the sliders used to specify the bounding box extents. In this example, the bounding box is defined from x equals 0 to 40, y equals negative 20 to positive 20, and z equals negative 15 to positive 15. With these controls, you can specify where exactly you want the quantization grid to be placed in 3D space. First-person view models are actually the perfect application for this. You can increase the resolution of the mesh that's in the camera view by defining the bounding box to exclude regions outside of the camera view. These are regions of space that the camera will never see, like behind the camera. And finally, here's a sneak peek at the kinds of things we've been able to do with this exporter. On the left is a Car 98K from NZP's demo release, and on the right we can see the same model aggressively optimized to retain iron sight details using the modified exporter. You can find the modified Blender MDL exporter on the NZP team's tools Git repo. And with that, I'll hand it over to Casey to show off some more of what we've been able to do with the modified exporter. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Derp Crusader, or Casey. I do models, animations, mapping, and some slight texture works for NZP. The use of Blub's exporters help minimize vertex swimming, which is that warbling you see on the model on the left while it's moving. I also helped add proper aim-down sights that are more or less accurate to World at War, as well as positioning them relative to how they look in-game for a nice feel. I also finished completely remodeling and reanimating all the guns featured in Nacht der Untoten, which were untouched from Beta 1.1, to get them up to current standards, including puncher animations, better modeled hands, unique pack-a-punch textures, and textures that don't have to conform to Quake's limited 256 color palette. Another goal was to reduce memory consumption. Some of the beta guns were upwards of 600 kilobytes, and I got them down to under 200 kilobytes each, while looking much better in the process. This is because I focused on what parts of the models are visible, and minimized the amount of frames used, as each extra frame is as memory consuming as a whole individual model with the same poly count. The goal was under 800 triangles and under 40 frames of animation, which got us under the goal of 200 kilobytes. I also did pass on the Perca-Cola machines to get them scaled properly with the Half-Life world scale in proportion to Call of Duty, as well as a slight poly count boost to help round off the edges.